We return to the scene of the greatest achievement in chess history, namely Fischer's performance in the Candidates in 1971, leading up to the World Championship against Spassky, where he won the match against Taimanov 6-0, against Larsen 6-0, and 6.5, 2.5 against Petrosian. And this will be game 4 against Larsen. Now, today in the Candidates, they play a tournament. Whoever wins the tournament plays the world champion. At that time, it was match play. So they would play the best of 10, and then whoever won that match would play the winner of the other match, like brackets. And this was match play against Larsen. This is game number 4. Fischer has black in this game, and Larsen has white. In fact, let's flip the board. What do you say? Okay, c4 from Larsen. Fischer plays g6, knight f3, bishop g7, d4, and knight to f6. Again, the king's Indian defense, not afraid to play very sharp chess at the highest level against the best opposition. Knight to c3, castles, and e4. Larsen, of course, is playing the classical approach where you get a nice full pawn center and try to suffocate the black pieces. d6, bishop e2, and e5. Fischer wants to gain his share of the center and put pressure on d4. Black has a dark square strategy in the king's Indian, so he attacks the dark squares first and primarily. Short castle for Larsen. Knight to c6, continuing to put pressure on d4. So now d5, that pawn advances. Knight to e7, and knight to d2. Now, today, the most commonly played move for black is knight to d7, with the idea of maybe after a5, jumping into the c5 square. But here, Fischer plays c5, which looks like a better move at first. I mean, we know white's main goal here is to try to play c5 and advance on the queen side. So by just putting a pawn on c5, doesn't it stop that permanently? Well, there's a reason why this is actually less popular. Yes, it does for the moment stop c5. The problem is, if white does crack open the queen side, black's position collapses very quickly. And there are a lot of times where white can sacrifice a piece for these d and c pawns, and these pawns just roll through the middle of the board. So that's why c5 is a little less common. And by the way, if Larsen were to take en passant after bc6, black is perfectly fine, has equalized, and is a nice center. So instead, he plays rook to b1, planning to play b4 to attack this c5 pawn, and he really wants to crack open Fischer's queen side. Knight to e8 from Fischer. The idea, obviously, is to unblock the f pawn so he can play f5 and attack on the king side. That's the main idea in these classical king's Indians. b4, and he doesn't want to take, so he plays b6. He wants to keep a pawn on c5 to prevent white from playing c5 himself. Larsen plays a4, just keeps rolling. Again, he wants to play a5 and crack open Fischer's queen side. Fischer continues with his play f5, increases the pressure on the e4 square and pawn, and at some point he can play f4 and advance on the king side. a5, Larsen continues his plan of, again, cracking open the queen side. And now knight to f6 from Fischer, increasing his pressure against e4 and moving the knight back to a more active square. Queen to a4 from Larsen. Now, his idea here is to move that queen to a3, where it accomplishes a lot. It puts pressure on c5, it puts pressure down the a file, and on a3, it can also help defend along the third rank if needs be. So a3 is a good square for that queen. Bishop to d7, and queen to a3. Now, we notice here, this bishop on g7 is not active on the long diagonal. It is blocked by this pawn at e5. So Fischer decides to activate it on a different diagonal. He plays bishop to h6. Since that's a fairly bad piece, he wouldn't mind trading that off for another piece on the board. Bishop to d3. Larsen supports the e4 pawn. Queen c7, capturing twice on c5. Now, Larsen takes on f5. Fischer could have taken with the knight. That would have been fine, aiming for the d4 square. But instead, he takes with the g-pawn. And one of the reasons he does this is the main strategy for white in this structure is to play f4, because he doesn't want these e and f pawns to be mobile and flexible. He wants to fix them in place, make them rigid. But in this position, obviously, Fischer could just take the pawn. So Fischer, he knew when he took here on f5 that he was going to be able to keep these pawns mobile, and he'd be able to advance them forward. Bishop to c2 from Larsen. Perhaps at some point he Might want to try to trade off the light-squared bishop. A6. Fischer is keeping Larsson's knight out of the b5 square. We can see how irritating a knight would be on that square, hitting the queen and this d6 pawn. So a6 keeps the knight out. The downside, of course, is that it does weaken this b6 square, where a rook can come and plant itself. Here, Larsson plays a very, when you see it at first, it looks like just a blunder, right? He plays knight d to e4. Well, isn't that just hanging a knight? Can't Fischer just take it? Well, he can't, because this knight aims at this knight, and then this bishop at c1 is aiming at the bishop, at h6. So he'd have to make a choice here. If knight takes e4, bishop takes h6, and Larsson would keep that material. So instead, Fischer goes ahead and takes on c1. Larsson takes on f6 with check, so he has that tempo from the check when he captures. Rook takes f6, and rook fc1. So Larsson has succeeded in trading off a couple of minor pieces. The question is, will that sufficiently reduce Fischer's attacking potential, or will he still be able to generate attacking play? We can see Larsson is over here on the queen side, ready for his queen side play, but Fischer's getting ready on the king side. So let's see how this breaks down. First, rook a to f8. The rooks are on the f-file, and they could potentially support this pawn's advance to the f3 square. Rook to b6 from Larsson, threatening this very valuable a6 pawn. If this pawn were to fall, then the pawn at a5 could advance. So Fischer goes ahead and defends that. That's an important pawn. He needs to keep that protected. Knight to e2. So what Larsson wants to do now is, again, play that f4 move we talked about earlier, and the knight on e2 supports that advance. So how is Fischer going to prevent him from carrying out his plan here? Yeah, he plays f4 first. And now white is not able to play the pawn to f4. The downside is Fischer has weakened this diagonal and some of the key central dark squares. The question is that enough of a problem? Probably not. Bishop to e4. So Larsson wants to keep control of f3, because at some point, pawn sacrifice to f3 could really wreck his position, and he knows that. Fischer plays knight to f5. This knight could jump into d4, but even more threatening, knight to h4, where it aims at g2 and again at f3, attacking these light squares around white's king. Larsson has to be very, very careful here. He plays rook to c6, but this just pushes Fischer's queen where it already wanted to go. So he's kind of helping Fischer in a way here. Queen to g7, and Fischer has lined his queen up with Larsson's king, and there's potential pressure on g2. Perhaps the best move for Larsson here was to just play king to h1 and make it so there's no pin on that g-pawn. But instead, he plays the more aggressive rook to b1. He wants to bring that rook down to b8 and threaten that bishop. And again, he wants to try to win this a6 pawn. But now Fischer gets an extra tempo to attack, and that's trouble. Knight to h4. Notice how the queen and knight both aim at g2. If this bishop at e4 were to disappear, Fischer could just play queen takes g2 mate. And that guides a lot of Fischer's moves here. He knows if he can distract that bishop, mate at g2 is just waiting. If rook takes c8, this was probably the best approach from Larsson, to just give up the exchange, get rid of that light squared bishop so he could control the light squares. He'd keep his light squared bishop. Fischer wouldn't have his. And after rook to c8, queen to h3, and he would be defended, but he'd be down in exchange. It actually looks like he's winning a piece here with an attack on the rook and this knight, but in fact, that would not win a piece because the rook would come to f8, and if queen takes knight, then rook to h6 would actually trap Larsson's queen. So it's not great for Larsson to do this, but it's better than what happens in the game. Queen to d3, just trying to increase his control of these light squares. But now bishop to f5, challenging that bishop on e4. And as we said before, if he were to take on f5, then queen g2 mate is played, because the pawn at g2 would no longer be defended. So here Larsson goes ahead and plays king to h1, but it's a little too late, unfortunately for him, and Fischer plays f3, and not only threatening mate, but also attacking this knight. If he takes with the pawn, just queen g2 mate. So it's a tough position. If he plays g3 to protect g2, then after bishop takes bishop, queen e2, pawn takes knight, And after the knight at h4 is recaptured with a pawn, then just rook takes f2. The threats, and then of course here with this pawn queening, are just too great. And if he takes with the queen, it's really the same story. This is a complete win for black, and white would have to resign. So how does he deal with the threat to g2 and the threat to the knight? Well, Larsson plays knight to g3. So he saves the knight, blocks the mate. The problem is Fischer can now take on g2 with check. And he can't recapture with the bishop because he would lose his queen. So he has to move his king to g1. But now Fischer takes on e4, queen takes e4, and knight to f3 check. And notice this knight has a very powerful destination on this square. The next move is forced. He has to retake that pawn at g2, but then knight to d2. And this is a decisive shot, forking the rook and the queen, as well as threatening rook to f2 check. And in this lost position, Bent Larsson resigned. But hey, what are you going to do? You're standing in front of a bulldozer. You got to get out of the way. Hope you enjoyed the game, this masterpiece of Fischer's greatest achievement. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.